Good morning. My name is Raj Puri. I'm an environmental anthropologist from the University of Kent in the UK. And I've been asked this morning to talk to you a little bit about international research on traditional knowledge for managing aquatic ecosystems. And I thought I would start with a few conceptual issues about traditional knowledge drawn from extensive research and cross-cultural work in the field of ethnobiology. And then I'll give you some examples of studies from outside of India that might be useful in your discussions about traditional knowledge, its documentation and application for managing aquatic ecosystems. Let's start with what is traditional knowledge. A few pointers, and I'm sure you know many of these things, but let's remind ourselves that knowledge is quite varied in terms of its form and its function. We can think of declarative knowledge as that verbalizable knowledge, like I'm speaking to you right now, that involves everything from names of fish to the stories about them, whether they are actual stories, myths, we might say, stories that are embedded in songs or poetry or any kind of oral or written literature. All of that is declarative knowledge. And then there's behavioral knowledge, which we often think about as the kinds of skills that we acquire doing different activities, such as how to make nets or traps, how to cast a fishing net, etc. And then there is performance knowledge, which I think of as kind of managerial knowledge. How do you manage people, tools, environments to be successful day in and day out fishing? And this is perhaps a little bit more meta knowledge in the sense of how do you apply what you know to be successful. And real experts have a lot of performance knowledge, and they can therefore be successful day in, day out. Now, another important distinction here is between knowing and doing, or what I call theoretical versus substantive knowledge. That is, people may know a lot about fish, but they may actually not do a lot with fish. In other words, they may know about certain kinds of traps that were used in the past, but nobody uses them now. And so we have to make this distinction between knowing and doing. There may be a lot of interesting and important theoretical knowledge that actually isn't used anymore, and there may be reasons for this. So it's not that we want to discount theoretical knowledge, it's just that we want to recognize the difference between what people say and what they do. Now, knowledge is not held by everyone in a community and it's not evenly distributed. We know that there's variation between people of different ages, of different sexes, of different occupations, and we have to be aware of that when we're studying knowledge because we want to make sure we get a good representation of the kind of knowledge. And it may be that there's very specialized knowledge and you only have one or two people that have that knowledge. But still, it's important to understand how knowledge is distributed across a community, and also to realize that traditional knowledge is not like a book. It is not static. It's actually changing all the time. Knowledge is being lost, it's being gained, it's being innovated as new uses come in, as conditions in the environment change, as new needs arise as well. So traditional knowledge is varied amongst people. It's always changing. It's quite dynamic. And learning it and transmitting it is really important, as we know. How you learn can be quite different depending on what form of knowledge we're talking about. Whether it's verbalizable, behavioral, or performance knowledge, those are learned in different ways. And so, again, we may have a lot of verbalized knowledge, but few behavioral skills because you simply don't have the opportunity to practice, observe, mimic elders or others who used to do things that they don't do anymore. And then, of course, the more experience one has, the more chance one has to acquire performance knowledge. Now, in studying traditional knowledge, and I'm sure you're going to be talking about this quite a lot, just a few reminders. One is that most traditional knowledge is, of course, stored in the local language, and it's really important to use local languages or to use very good and well-trained interpreters to talk to people in their local language about their knowledge about fish, fishing, etc. The other thing that's very important is that one has to spend time doing this. It's not like one just opens a book and starts reading. Usually, traditional knowledge doesn't come out linearly or in any kind of sensible order. And it takes time to establish rapport and trust with people so that they'll start telling you things. Apprenticeship is often a very good way to learn, that is, learn how to fish yourself. And having people teach you is a great way to begin to understand how knowledge is transmitted in that community and also what is known and what is important. And here's a very important point, which a lot of people don't realize, is that the more you know about the domain, the more you will learn. That is, people tend to talk to the level that they think you are at. And if they think you know nothing about fish, they're probably going to tell you very superficial and basic things that they tell to a child. So the more you know, the more you can have sophisticated, high level conversations with people who just remember they've spent their whole lives working on these domains and have fairly sophisticated knowledge. Okay, so what kinds of fishing knowledge are there? Now, I'm sure you all know these, and I'll just go through them quickly just to remind you of all the different kinds of knowledge that might be held. Obviously, there are the kinds of fish that are found in a particular area and how they're classified, how people relate them to each other, which may tell you a lot about their understanding of these fish. People may have stories and myths about where fish come from, um, and also within this kind of oral or written literature, there may be a lot of information about the symbolic or religious significance of fish to peoples, these more cultural aspects of people's relationship to fish. And then you might have kind of the more material kind of knowledge that people have about the anatomy and physiology of fish, about their life cycles, about where and when they spawn, how they migrate or don't migrate. Um, there may be a lot of knowledge about what fish eat and where they tend to be at different times of the year, obviously, feeding and habitat preferences. And there's something I call enemies and friends. That is, fish are parts of ecological communities, and there may be companion species that they tend to hang out with or be found with, and they may have predators themselves or be predators. And so those ecological relationships are often quite important, and local people often know of these very well. Then there is knowledge sort of about the activities associated with fishing. That is, where and when to catch certain species and under what conditions are more likely to be beneficial or successful. They understand things about the hydrology and river and stream characteristics in this regard. Of course, there's all that knowledge about material culture and technology associated with traps and nets and spears and bait and poisons and the use of dams and weirs, etc. And then there's that kind of behavioral performance knowledge about how to fish, how to collect information about the conditions, to communicate with other people about their recent experiences and knowledge, how to collect and set bait or to set nets, to cast, throw, how to harvest fish, to transport it, to clean it, to store it, to distribute it, even to reflect upon it. So this whole sequence of tasks, which we might say makes up a fishing event or an expedition, or a bout, however you want to call it, goes way beyond the simple throwing out a net and hauling in fish. There are activities before and after that that require knowledge and that may be really important. And then, of course, there's all that managerial knowledge that people have about managing fish and people and habitats. And let me say a little bit more about that. By managing fish, we're talking about people's interventions in reproduction of fish through hatcheries, through protecting spawning sites, through prohibitions against fishing on full moons or when 1 or 2 days a week, on Sundays, for instance. There may be knowledge about moving spawn or eggs to other places, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Knowledge about, and there may actually be feeding activity. People may feed or provide food for different kinds of fish. For instance, planting fruit trees or other kinds of trees along banks that fish like. People may manage environments by controlling what goes into them. So I talk about pollution, but also there's erosion and controlling vegetation. There's actually building earth or river works such as dams, canals, ponds that involve managing the environment for fish. And then there's all the managing of people that is involved, that is managing through belief systems or norms and values that regulate or that underpin people's choices about what to fish when and with what potential implications. There are all the rules that people have for access, both insiders and outsiders, the sanctions associated with breaking those rules. And there are sort of hierarchies of control when we look at the management of people in fishing. That is local rules, regional rules, maybe national rules, and all of these kind of interact on the ground. Okay, so a few important sources that you might be interested in. I think a lot of the work done on traditional knowledge and fisheries can be traced back to work by Robert Johannes, who worked in Micronesia and Polynesia in the Pacific Ocean and started writing about the uses of traditional knowledge and fisheries management. There's a recent collection of his works. He died in 2002. And one of his co-researchers, Kenneth Ruddle, who sort of carries the mantle of looking at marine traditional knowledge anyway, has put together a sort of collection of his works. And if you just look at the titles that I've listed here, you see that he looked at pretty much every kind of traditional knowledge and use of traditional knowledge in terms of fisheries that you could imagine, looking at laws, co-management, conservation, improving fisheries and resource management, dealing with marine protected areas, with seafood technologies, with environmental impact assessments, with training government fisheries personnel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he really was a groundbreaker in this, and well worth looking at that material if you're not already familiar with it. I thought I'd mention the commercial extinction of the northern cod, which many people have looked at as researchers into why this happened. Why did the huge Grand Banks off of the coast of Canada and the United States collapse in the early 1990s? That is become commercially unviable. And a lot of research has gone into this. But as you could imagine, one of the major causes, of course, is the introduction of commercial fishing in that area. And of course, you had a 300-year-old tradition of inshore fisheries by fishing communities. And there you see the difference between a hull of a fishing trawler and a local fisherman. So you can imagine what the impacts would be. And this particular author, Tom McGuire, gives a bunch of explanations for what happened, both sort of politically and culturally, and factors involving actually the biology and the ecology of fish themselves. But he also recognizes that early warnings that could have been raised by local communities were not taken into account, that the local fishers had knowledge of declining yields, changes in technologies, and size of fish caught in traps, and they could have perhaps been an early warning system for the larger offshore fisheries that collapsed and has damaged the whole of the North Atlantic fishery. And this leads to another important contribution by Eleanor Ostrom, who did a very huge comparative study of different systems for managing common pool resources, such as fish around the world, and came up with these principles for designing the management of a common pool resource, such as fish. And these are very important. They've been discussed in numerous articles and have been applied many times around the world. And I suppose it's definitely a starting point for thinking about how to work with communities to manage resources. Can we come up with a co-management plan that follows some of these principles to ensure that it will work? A good example of community-based management of fisheries resources in the marine world anyway is the lobster fisheries of Maine off the northeast coast of North America, which are also 300-year-old fisheries, but unlike the inshore fisheries for cod, have been sustainable and in fact have proved to be quite resilient over a very long period of time, and very good management of lobster territories, and the limitation on the number of permits that can be given has kept this industry successful. I thought I would also say something about the Hawaiian case, which is where I did my graduate study, so I know about this quite well. This is a sort of taxonomy of the sort of ecological space of Hawaiian fishermen in the sea. And what we found is that native Hawaiians divided up the sea like we divide up the landscape into different ecotopes or habitats where different kinds of fish could be found and different kinds of techniques and different levels of access applied. And a very sophisticated, very complex kind of system. And this kind of traditional knowledge, a lot of people don't realize exists. And you would imagine you'd even find it in a riverine system. So something to pay attention to. And what's interesting about the Hawaiian system, of course, is that it integrated both land and sea in one management system, recognizing that the flow of fresh water from the mountains down through the valleys and into the sea affected the oceans and the fish, both inland and in the sea. So managing fisheries often involves managing land around the fisheries. And this, I think, is a good lesson to remember. A more holistic, integrated approach to land and sea management is probably going to be really important. Closer to all of us in Northeast India is the work done in the Mekong River Basin between Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. And in this case, two things to mention here is the local knowledge about these fish sanctuaries, which are deep water refugia for fish during the dry season, which have been discovered up and down the Mekong. More than 200 have been identified. Many of them are protected by local communities because they know this is where fish congregate during the dry seasons, and they are sanctioned or protected in some cases, or also used for fishing with some controls as to who can access them. This is a very important discovery, and with government support, many of these communities have turned these fishing sanctuaries into fish conservation zones, where they then establish a set of written rules about access, and these are validated by the government. It's a really important thing. Also important to realize here is that these rules, which are derived by the community, are meant to be applicable to themselves and outsiders. No, not two separate rules for insiders and outsiders is not allowed in this case. Anyway, these fishing conservation, these zones have shown real resilience and success in improving the number of fish available for people. And so are a really good example of how to design local co-management of fisheries. Again, I mentioned this earlier. In the Pacific Northwest, off the coast of Canada and Alaska, native First Nations people have been harvesting herring and salmon for millennia, and they know how to manage these fisheries, and they are in fact using their traditional knowledge to move herring spawn and herring populations around it back to areas where it has disappeared, to kind of reseed the environment for herring. And herring is one of those base fish that feeds the whole ecosystem, all the way up to whales and humans. So extremely important, and its decline in that area has been recognized, and now people are using their knowledge to physically manage and increase the populations of herring. A similar kind of story of the arapaima fish from the Amazon and from South America. And this is a story of from Guyana, where local environmental managers that saw that this was the Arapaima was being overharvested and threatened. Went to Brazil to get local people that were successfully managing Arapaima and brought them to Guyana to teach local people how to identify and monitor the species, and then to effectively and sustainably use them and generate income over time. And with that, it sort of reemerged a traditional social norms and sanctions against illegal harvesting, which had kind of been left by the side over time. This is a really nice example of how one community has transferred their experience to another from another country, in fact. And this kind of exchange of knowledge, literally bringing people to new communities to teach them, I think is extremely clever and relevant. Sometimes the best teachers are your neighbors. Okay, that's really what I had to say for this morning. I hope this has been interesting. Here's just a few summary of what I've mentioned, that traditional knowledge is much more complex in form. It varies across groups. It's not static. It's linked to norms and values and belief systems that is socially and culturally embedded, and these need to be understood as well. It takes time to research and document traditional knowledge, and you need to be as clever and as smart and as knowledgeable about the domain as your informants and respondents. There are lots of international case studies out there that are both from the marine and inland world that are worth looking at. And in many cases, there are good examples of traditional knowledge being recognized and incorporated into fisheries management and conservation. And one of the things that I have seen, at least in this initial kind of survey, is the importance of local government support for traditional knowledge in community-based natural resource management or co-management. Validation, acceptance of the community's knowledge, respect for it, and allowing communities to try to manage these things with their support is really, I think, key. At least that's what the cross-cultural and international data seem to suggest. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope you have a good day of discussions. Bye-bye.